The morning began like any other, yet there was something heavy in the air, a subtle charge that people who had been waiting years for a promise could feel in their bones. It was not the kind of day where the sun rose brighter or the birds sang louder, but rather one where everything felt just slightly more urgent, like the world was holding its breath. In small corners of the internet, the kind where dinar investors gathered in secretive chat rooms and private groups, whispers had begun to grow louder. Screenshots were shared in bursts accompanied by heart-pounding captions, exchange locations updated, banks moving quietly. This is it. For most outsiders, these words meant nothing, but to those who had held their dinar through long years of mockery, doubt, and endless delays, those words were like a crack in the dam that had held back their hopes. At first, it was cautious optimism. After all, hadn't they been here before? How many times had dates been announced, only to pass with nothing more than disappointment? The experienced ones warned the newcomers to be careful, to not let their hopes explode too soon. But then something different began to happen. The whispers weren't just talk anymore, they were supported with actual evidence. Someone posted a picture of a bank memo stamped with an official logo. Another claimed their contact inside a major branch had confirmed that special staff were being trained for private client exchanges. Normally, these claims would have been dismissed as fabrications. But the volume of consistent details coming from different states, different banks, and different sources was overwhelming. By late morning, people began driving to their local branches to see for themselves. They weren't expecting to walk in and exchange on the spot, but they needed to feel the truth in their own eyes. What they found was startling. Banks that normally closed their doors early were staying open late into the night. Extra cars were parked in restricted lots, and in some places, unmarked delivery trucks were seen pulling into side entrances. Windows that were once open to the public now had blinds drawn tightly. Inside, through the glass doors, figures could be seen in quiet meetings, papers being signed, and desks being set up that hadn't been there the week before. To a stranger passing by, it may have looked like a normal business day. To someone who had been waiting for the RV, it looked like the beginning of something extraordinary. Forums that day became electric. One man reported that his brother-in-law, who worked as a mid-level employee in a Midwest bank, had been asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement after being brought into a private meeting. Another woman claimed her banker friend in Texas hinted that the special exchange rooms were being prepared but refused to say more. People began to connect the dots, piecing together what felt like a puzzle that had been years in the making. Every small detail, no matter how insignificant, was magnified. A bank that suddenly changed its opening hours. A teller who seemed nervous when asked about currency services. A manager who said, "We can't comment on that," when asked directly about the dinar. Each moment was added to the growing mountain of evidence. The energy of anticipation was almost unbearable. Investors who had been holding onto their dinar for years began pulling out their notes, smoothing the creases, and stacking them neatly on their tables at home. Families gathered in living rooms, debating what rates would come out, what they would do once the moment arrived. Some spoke cautiously, as if afraid that talking too boldly would break the fragile spell. Others laughed nervously, their voices quivering with the mixture of fear and joy that comes when dreams step closer to reality. They spoke about debts that could be cleared, businesses that could finally be funded, and futures that could be rewritten overnight. And yet, underneath it all, there was a strange stillness. The banks weren't announcing anything officially. No news channels were covering it. The world at large was carrying on, oblivious to what was brewing behind those locked glass doors. But the community of believers could feel it. They had lived through too many false alarms to not recognize that something about this day was different. Their intuition screamed that the tide was turning, and the bank's silence was no longer a denial. It was confirmation. The quieter they stayed, the more convinced people became that massive change was happening under the radar. As the day stretched on, the signs only grew stronger. Reports came from multiple cities of extra security stationed near bank branches. A man in Florida swore he saw armored vehicles parked behind his local Wells Fargo, while another in California said he had spoken briefly with a teller who gave him a knowing smile when he mentioned exchange locations. That smile, small as it was, sent ripples through the online groups, igniting hope like a spark in dry grass. People clung to these details, replaying them in their minds, posting and reposting them, feeding the growing fire of belief. The waiting that day was unlike any other. It was no longer the waiting of despair, the waiting that had accompanied countless delays. It was the waiting before a storm, when the winds shift and the air grows heavy, when you know something is coming even though the skies have not yet opened. Every moment felt stretched, every hour passed with hearts pounding faster, as if the entire nation of dinar holders was leaning forward in unison, ready for the first domino to fall. For years, the dream had lived in the background of their lives, mocked by some, doubted by many, but kept alive by those unwilling to let go. That day, for the first time, it felt like the dream was stepping out of the shadows into reality. The banks were moving, the locations were being updated, and the whispers were turning into a chorus. Whether the world knew it or not, something was happening, and those who had waited for so long felt it in the depths of their souls. It wasn't just another rumor, it was the moment when patience and faith began to collide with destiny. On the morning of October 1st, it began quietly, almost unnoticeably. There was no announcement on the news, no televised press conferences, no breaking alerts on financial channels. Instead, the first signs came through hushed phone calls and coded messages between friends. A man in Ohio, who had been in constant contact with his banker, received a short text, "Your bank is live. Appointment today." His heart raced as he stared at the screen, hardly believing the words. After years of waiting, of rumors that led to nothing, he suddenly felt a tremor of reality under his feet. He didn't dare show anyone the message at first. But once he walked into that appointment, the silence in the branch, the close, doff office, and the solemn handshake from the manager told him it was real. When he walked out an hour later, the paper in his hand confirmed everything an exchange had happened. Stories like his began to surface all over the country, but never in the way people expected. There were no long lines wrapping around bank corners. There was no chaos of crowds storming into lobbies. Instead, it was happening behind closed doors, one person at a time, almost like an underground operation. Exchange desks had been prepared in advance, quiet rooms away from the regular traffic of customers. Staff had been briefed with strict instructions. Each transaction was handled discreetly, without so much as a whisper to anyone outside the process. By mid-morning, social media began buzzing, but not in direct words. People who had sworn to secrecy found ways to communicate through symbols and cryptic hints. Some posted pictures of money bag emojis, others used vault doors or lightning bolts. A few risked more, uploading blurred images of receipts that showed astonishing exchange rates, their names and identifying details carefully hidden. The community that had long lived in the shadows, mocked as dreamers, suddenly had proof. Something had shifted. And the timing was uncanny. October 1st, the start of a new fiscal year, the date so many had whispered about. As the stories grew, so did the disbelief. Investors who had not yet received calls began flooding their contacts with questions. Was it really happening? Could it be possible that their years of waiting were finally being rewarded? Friends called friends, families passed messages down the line, voices quivering with excitement. Some couldn't believe it until they saw someone they trusted confirm it. Others didn't care about proof anymore. The energy in the air was enough to make them believe. In cities across the nation, the same quiet scene was unfolding. People walked into banks by appointment, sat down in closed rooms with managers and clerks who looked both nervous and excited, and walked out with their lives changed forever. There were no fireworks, no applause, no public acknowledgement, but the look in their eyes as they stepped out into the street told the story. Some cried openly, tears streaming down their faces as they clutched their documents. Others sat in their cars for hours, hands trembling on the steering wheel, unable to drive, overwhelmed by the sudden weight of their new reality. By noon, the energy was impossible to contain. Online groups lit up with thousands of messages. Screenshots were passed around like sacred relics, each one sending waves of hope through those who had not yet exchanged. Some warned caution, reminding others that rates could vary, that processes were strict, that banks would not tolerate leaks. But the caution did little to cool the fire spreading through the community. After so many false starts, people were desperate to feel the moment. And this time, the moment felt real. Banks themselves were under immense pressure. Staff were told not to speak a word, to handle each appointment with professionalism and secrecy. Yet, even behind their quiet facades, there was tension. They knew they were part of history, part of a change that could ripple across economies. Some employees whispered to each other in the break rooms, marveling at the amounts of money being exchanged in mere minutes. Others avoided eye contact, too afraid to slip and reveal what was happening, but the truth was clear. The system was live, the wheels were turning, and the quiet activation had begun. For the people walking into those appointments, it was like stepping into another world. The process was smooth, almost clinical. ID checks, paperwork, signatures, and then the revelation of the rate. Many described it later in hushed tones, the shock of seeing numbers they never thought would appear in front of them. The kind of numbers that erased debts in an instant, that turned modest lives into ones of abundance. For some, it was disbelief. They checked the papers again and again, expecting some mistake. For others, it was relief so deep it left them speechless, as though the weight of years had suddenly lifted from their shoulders. Outside the banks, the world moved on, unaware. People went to work, children went to school, traffic filled the highways. But within the hidden corners of financial offices, something monumental was unfolding. Families who had sacrificed, who had endured ridicule for holding onto their dinar, were suddenly faced with the reality of transformation. They whispered about paying off houses, funding charities, helping relatives, or finally living the life they had dreamed of in secret. By evening, the quiet exchanges had built into a wave. The community online was louder than ever, though still speaking in riddles. Posts of celebration filled timelines, some subtle, some overflowing with joy that could not be contained. A few shared personal stories, like the mother who walked out of the bank and called her daughter in tears, saying, "It's real, sweetheart. It finally happened." Or the man who had lived paycheck to paycheck for years and now sat staring at the account balance that would change his children's future. What made it surreal was not just the money, but the secrecy. It was happening nationwide, yet hidden from plain view. It was the kind of event most people would expect to see on the evening news, broadcast with bold headlines. Instead, it was carried on whispers, texts, and coded confirmations. The world at large still hadn't caught on, and maybe that was the point. It was not meant to be a storm that everyone saw coming. It was designed to slip in quietly, touching those who were ready, those who had prepared, those who had held the faith through every setback. By the time the sun set on October 1st, thousands had already stepped through the doors of their banks and into a new life. Thousands more waited anxiously for their call, their chance to walk the same path. And though the outside world carried on as if nothing had changed, those who knew understood that everything had changed. The banks were live, the exchanges were real, and history was being written in silence. By the time the evening descended, the atmosphere across countless households was charged with a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. Families gathered in living rooms, kitchens, and dining tables, eyes glued to phones, refreshing group chats every second, waiting for the next confirmation. Some had already received their calls and gone through the process earlier that day, but for many, it was still anticipation, an invisible tension pulling everyone forward. The hum of conversation filled rooms as people spoke about the future in hushed yet eager voices, as though speaking too loudly might break the delicate thread of reality. The whispers of exchanges that morning had become a roar by nightfall, and even those who had doubted were starting to see that something truly monumental was unfolding. In one household, a father sat at the table with his family, holding his phone tightly in his hand. His brother had just completed his appointment hours earlier and had sent a message that made him cry confirmation that the exchange was real. that the rates were beyond imagination. He could hardly process the thought that within hours, his family's life could shift completely. His wife sat across from him, quietly crying, not from fear but from the overwhelming relief that the years of waiting and enduring ridicule from relatives had not been in vain. Their children, too young to fully understand the details, sensed the emotion and excitement, their laughter echoing in the room, lifting the weight of years of uncertainty. All across the country, similar stories unfolded. Friends who had mocked one another in the past now called in tears to apologize and congratulate. Old investors who had quietly held onto their dinar in secret now revealed their faith had been justified. The exchange wasn't just a financial transaction, it was vindication. For years, people had been told it was a scam, a fantasy, a waste of time. They had endured skepticism, rolled eyes, and even broken relationships over their belief. But now, with receipts in hand, with real appointments scheduled, their patience had turned into proof. Phones buzzed with constant updates. In one online group, a woman shared how she had walked into her appointment nervous, hands shaking, heart pounding, unsure if she would be turned away. She described sitting in a quiet office, signing papers and being told the rate. Her hands had gone cold, her throat tightening as she realized what she was hearing was no dream. She admitted she broke down crying at the table, unable to hold back the release of emotions bottled up for years. When she finished her story, the group exploded with messages of joy, support, and prayers, as others held onto her experience like a glimpse of their own future. By now, even those who hadn't been called yet were certain of what was happening. There was no way to deny it anymore. Too many stories, too much consistency, too many details matched from one coast to another. Banks had truly gone live, and though the world outside seemed oblivious, news anchors talking about politics, sports games filling stadiums, people living as if nothing had shifted. The Dinar community knew the truth. They were witnessing a quiet revolution. For those waiting, every sound felt magnified. A phone vibrating on the counter, a knock at the door, even the distant ring of someone else's call, filled hearts with a surge of hope that their turn had arrived. Parents held their children a little tighter that night, knowing that tomorrow they might wake up debt-free with possibilities that had been locked away suddenly within reach. Couples whispered plans about paying off mortgages, traveling to places they had only seen in pictures, or finally supporting causes they cared about but never had the means to help. The dreams that had once seemed too far were suddenly stretching out within arm's reach. The secrecy surrounding the entire process added to the surreal atmosphere. Many were told to keep quiet, to not share details, to avoid drawing attention, and yet the joy was too immense to hide completely. Subtle celebrations happened behind closed doors, family dinners where smiles refused to fade, prayers of gratitude whispered late at night, quiet toasts made with trembling hands. For every family that had already exchanged, there was an unshakable sense that their lives had been rewritten, and for those still waiting, there was unrelenting faith that their moment was just around the corner. Meanwhile, the banks continued their silent operation. Appointment after appointment was conducted under watchful eyes, with staff instructed to maintain composure and secrecy. Security was tight, the processes deliberate, every exchange recorded with precision. Employees, though bound by rules, could not fully mask the weight of what they were part of. Some described it later as surreal, watching people walk in burdened by years of financial struggle and walk out lighter, transformed with a glow that could not be hidden. It was as if the walls of those private exchange rooms had witnessed more tears of joy in one day than in decades. For the community of believers, the night became one of the most unforgettable in their lives. Chatrooms filled with prayers, thanks, and stories of families crying together as they realized their sacrifices had not been in vain. Old arguments were set aside, grudges forgotten, as unity grew among people who had endured the same long wait. They shared tips, reassured one another, and reminded the still, waiting not to lose faith. The unspoken agreement was clear. This was bigger than any individual. It was history happening in real time. As the hours passed and darkness settled, exhaustion began to mix with exhilaration. People who had been on edge all day finally allowed themselves to rest, though few could truly sleep. Minds raced with possibilities, plans for tomorrow, plans for years ahead, visions of freedom that had once seemed impossible. The dinar exchange wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about the restoration of hope, about the validation of dreams that had been ridiculed. For many, it was spiritual, a promise fulfilled after years of endurance, a reward for holding on when everything seemed lost. By midnight, the realization had fully sunk in. The revaluation was no longer a myth whispered in dark corners. It was reality, quietly woven into the fabric of the nation's banks, carried out behind closed doors but felt in the hearts of thousands of families. The world outside had no idea, but for those who had lived the wait, nothing would ever be the same again. They had entered October as doubters, dreamers, and believers clinging to a fragile hope. By the end of the first day, they were witnesses to a transformation, proof that patience and faith had collided with destiny. That night, as families finally drifted to restless sleep, a shared understanding hung in the air like electricity. This was only the beginning. The exchanges had started quietly, but soon the impact would ripple outward. For now, though, they savored the moment in silence, a secret joy that pulsed through their hearts with every heartbeat. The banks were live, the locations were updated, and the dream had finally stepped out of the shadows and into reality.